But just as she began to collect herself, a soft noise from behind made her freeze. It was faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakable, a sound coming from within the walls of the safe room. Sophia's blood ran cold as she slowly turned, her eyes scanning the room. The walls were solid, impenetrable, or so she had thought. But now there was movement. A small panel in the wall was shifting, sliding open just enough to reveal a hidden passage. And in the darkness beyond, a figure stood watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Luca. Chapter 6. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as the small panel in the wall creaked open, revealing the shadowy figure lurking in the hidden passage. She took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps as her mind raced for some kind of explanation. This room was supposed to be a fortress, a place where nothing and no one could reach her. But now, someone has found her. The figure stepped forward, and the dim light from the room cast just enough glow on their face for her to make out the sharp features. It wasn't one of Luca's men, nor was it anyone she had seen before. Whoever they were, they didn't belong here. "Don't scream," the figure whispered, their voice low and hurried. Sophia's pulse raced as she pressed her back against the far wall, her body tense with fear. She didn't know if she should scream for help or stay silent and listen to what this intruder had to say. Her mind warred with her instincts, but before she could decide, the stranger raised their hands in a show of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," they said quietly, glancing toward the door as if expecting Luca to burst through it at any moment. "I'm here to help you." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. "Help me." The figure nodded, stepping closer. They were a woman, young, maybe a few years older than Sophia, with sharp eyes and a sense of urgency about her. "I don't have time to explain everything, but you need to trust me. If you stay here, they'll find you. The Ferraros won't stop until they get what they want." Sophia frowned, confusion swirling with the fear inside her. "And what do they want?" The woman's eyes darkened. "They want to destroy Luca, and you're the key to that. They'll use you to break him." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. She was nothing more than a pawn in this dangerous game between Luca and his enemies. The woman moved quickly, reaching out to grab Sophia's wrist. "Come with me," she urged. "I can get you out of here before they break through. If you stay, you'll be caught in the crossfire." Sophia hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. This was her chance to escape from Luca, to free herself from the dangerous world he had trapped her in. She should take it. She should run and never look back. But something made her pause. Her mind flashed back to Luca, the way he had looked at her, the way he had touched her, the strange, conflicted emotions in his eyes when he had told her he was trying to keep her safe. Despite everything, despite his ruthlessness and his cold demeanor, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Luca than what he showed the world. And if she left now, would she ever understand what that was? Sophia stammered, her voice uncertain. "I don't know." The woman's grip on her wrist tightened. "You don't have time to think about this. Luca isn't going to protect you forever. He only cares about his own power. Sophia's mind spun. She knew the woman was right. Luca was dangerous, unpredictable. He had taken her prisoner without a second thought. But why had he seemed so different when he had pulled her into the safe room? Why had there been that fleeting moment where he had looked at her like she was more than just a pawn in his game? Before she could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the room. Sophia's heart leapt into her throat as she realized Luca was coming back. The woman's eyes widened in panic, and she tugged on Sophia's wrist, urging her toward the hidden passage. "Now," she hissed. "You need to decide now." Sophia glanced toward the door, then back at the hidden passage. Her mind was torn between the safety the woman promised and the unknown pull she felt toward Luca. She should escape. She should run far away from this dangerous man and the chaos that surrounded him. But something inside her, something she couldn't explain, held her back. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. The woman's eyes flashed with frustration, but she released Sophia's wrist, stepping back into the shadows of the passage. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice cold now. "Don't say I didn't warn you." And with that, the panel slid shut, leaving Sophia alone in the silence of the room, her heart racing in her chest. Moments later, the heavy metal door to the safe room creaked open, and Luca stepped inside, his dark eyes immediately locking onto hers. His presence filled the room, suffocating and intense, and for a brief moment, Sophia felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. But that relief was short-lived as Luca's gaze darkened, his jaw clenched. "What happened?" Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She could still feel the weight of the woman's grip on her wrist, the temptation to run, to escape. But she hadn't. She had stayed, and now she didn't know how to explain why. She began, but the words caught in her throat. Luca stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room as if he sensed something was off. "Someone was here," he said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. Sophia swallowed hard, her mind racing. She could lie. She could tell him nothing happened, that she had been alone the whole time. But something about the way Luca was looking at her made it impossible to lie. "Yes," she whispered. "A woman." She came through a hidden passage in the wall. Luca's expression hardened, and for a moment, he said nothing. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing second, and Sophia could feel the weight of his anger building. "Did she touch you?" he asked, his voice sharp. Sophia blinked, surprised by the question. "What?" Luca's gaze bore into hers, a dangerous fire burning in his eyes. "Did she touch you? Did she hurt you?" Sophia shook her head quickly, her pulse racing. "No, she didn't hurt me. She told me to leave. She said I wasn't safe here." Luca's jaw tightened, and he turned away from her, his fists clenching at his sides. "The Ferraros are getting bolder," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "They're willing to send spies right into my home." Sophia watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something different about him now. He was still dangerous, still unpredictable, but there was a tension in his posture, a sense of vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "You should have left," Luca said suddenly, his voice cold as he turned back to face her. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "What?" "You should have taken the chance to escape when you had it," Luca continued, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I'm not going to protect you forever, Sophia. The Ferraros will keep coming, and one day, I might not be here to stop them." Sophia's mind reeled. Was he pushing her away? Was he trying to scare her into leaving? "I stayed," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I stayed because—" Luca's gaze locked onto hers, the intensity in his eyes making her heart race. "Because what?" Sophia took a deep breath, forcing herself to speak the words she had been too afraid to admit before. "Because I didn't want to leave." For a moment, the air between them was thick with silence, charged with unspoken emotions. Luca's expression softened, just slightly, and he took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're a fool, Sophia," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous, but there was a flicker of something else in his gaze, something that made her pulse quicken. Before she could respond, Luca's hand slid up her arm, his fingers grazing her skin lightly. The touch sent a shiver through her, and she hated how her body reacted to him, how she couldn't help but lean into the warmth of his touch. "I told you I'd protect you," Luca whispered, his lips dangerously close to hers. "But it comes at a price." Sophia's breath hitched as his fingers slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. The heat between them was undeniable, the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Her heart pounded in her chest as Luca's gaze darkened with desire, his lips inches from hers. "I don't care about the price," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and longing. And then, in one swift motion, Luca closed the distance between them, his lips crashing against hers with a hunger that left her breathless. The kiss was fierce, possessive, as if he was claiming her, marking her as his. Sophia's body melted against him, her hands gripping his arms as she gave into the intensity of the moment. But just as quickly as it had begun, Luca pulled away, his breath ragged as he stared down at her, his eyes filled with a mix of desire and something deeper, something more dangerous. "This is a game you don't want to play, Sophia," he whispered, his voice strained. Sophia's heart raced, her mind spinning. But it was too late. She was already in the game, and there was no turning back. Before either of them could say another word, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the mansion, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps approaching the safe room. Luca's expression hardened, the moment between them shattered by the looming danger. "They're here," he muttered, his hand gripping hers as he pulled her toward the door. "Stay close." Sophia's heart pounded as they stepped into the hallway, her mind racing. The Ferraros were closing in, and with each step they took, the danger grew. But as Luca led her deeper into the shadows of his world, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she was falling into something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just caught in a Mafia war. She was caught in Luca Moretti's heart. The mansion had fallen into chaos. The sound of gunfire echoed through the vast halls, each shot sending a fresh wave of fear surging through Sophia's veins. Luca gripped her hand tightly as he pulled her down a dimly lit corridor, his face set in a hard, dangerous expression. There was no time for questions, no time to process the kiss they had just shared. Danger was closing in fast, and the Ferraros were coming for both of them. "Stay behind me," Luca commanded, his voice sharp, protective. It was no longer a game, no longer about dominance or control. This was survival. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she followed closely, her thoughts spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had no idea where Luca was leading her or what awaited them at the end of this chase. All she knew was that the stakes had never been higher. And despite the terror coursing through her, a part of her, an irrational, uncontrollable part, felt safer with Luca than she ever had before. They turned a corner, and Luca stopped abruptly, pressing Sophia against the wall as he peered around the next bend. She could feel the heat of his body against hers, his breath steady even as the chaos unfolded around them. He was calm, in control, while her own heart raced uncontrollably. She wished she could share even a fraction of his composure. "How many of them are there?" Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. Luca's eyes flicked to hers briefly, but he didn't answer right away. His focus was on the corridor ahead, every muscle in his body tense, as if ready to strike at any moment. "A small group," he said finally, his voice low. "But it doesn't matter. They're not getting to you." Sophia's pulse quickened at the intensity in his words. She had no reason to trust Luca, not after everything he had put her through, not after the countless times he had proven how ruthless he could be. But the way he stood in front of her now, shielding her with his very presence, stirred something deep inside her. She didn't know what it was, whether it was fear, desire, or something more dangerous, but it left her breathless. "They're coming for you, not me," Sophia whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "You don't have to protect me." Luca's jaw tightened, and he turned to face her fully, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that left no room for argument. "I told you before, Sophia. You're mine now, and I protect what's mine." His words sent a shiver down her spine, not just from the possessiveness in them, but from the strange sense of comfort they brought. She should hate him for saying that, for claiming her like some object in this dangerous game. But instead, she felt her heart race with a new kind of fear, the fear that she was beginning to believe him. Before she could respond, Luca grabbed her wrist and pulled her forward again, guiding her deeper into the mansion. The gunfire was closer now, the thud of footsteps heavy in the air as Luca's men fought to keep the intruders at bay. They rounded another corner, and this time Luca led her down a narrow staircase, hidden behind a wall panel. The passage was dark and cramped, the walls pressing in on either side of them. Sophia stumbled slightly, her legs weak from both fear and exhaustion, but Luca's hand never left hers, steadying her as they descended deeper into the shadows. "Where are we going?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To the tunnels beneath the estate," Luca replied. "It's the safest way out." Sophia's mind reeled. Out. Did that mean he was letting her go? For a moment, hope flickered in her chest, but it was quickly extinguished when Luca turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You'll stay with me until this is over," he said, his voice leaving no room for debate. "Then we'll decide what happens next." Sophia's heart sank. Of course. She wasn't free. She was still his prisoner, caught in the web of his dangerous world. But there was something different now, something about the way he looked at her, like she was more than just a pawn in his game. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, hidden beneath the layers of steel and control. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Luca led her through a long, narrow tunnel. The air was damp and cold, the only light coming from the flickering bulbs overhead. Sophia's breath came in shallow gasps as the tension in her body grew, every step feeling heavier than the last. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the tunnel. Luca pushed it open, revealing a small room, furnished sparsely with a bed, a table, and a few chairs. It wasn't luxurious like the rest of the mansion, but it was secure. "This is where you'll stay," Luca said, his voice calm but authoritative. Sophia looked around the room, her stomach churning with unease. "You're leaving me here?" Luca's eyes softened, just for a moment. "I have to deal with the Ferraros." "This is the safest place for you?" Sophia shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "What if they find me?" "They won't," Luca said firmly, stepping closer to her. "I've handled worse." His presence was overwhelming, and despite everything, Sophia found herself drawn to him, drawn to the darkness, to the danger, to the man who stood before her. He was ruthless, terrifying, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him, something beneath the armor he wore so tightly around his heart. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to protect me." Luca's gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, she saw something raw and vulnerable in his eyes. "I do," he murmured. "I can't explain it, but I do." Sophia's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat as the space between them seemed to shrink. His hand lifted to her cheek, his touch soft but firm, as if he was afraid to let go. She could feel the heat of his body, the magnetic pull that drew her closer to him even when she knew she should stay away. "You should hate me," Luca whispered, his voice low, dangerous. "But you don't." Sophia's pulse quickened, her mind spinning with the truth in his words. She should hate him. She should despise him for everything he had done to her. But as his thumb gently traced the line of her jaw, she realized that her feelings were far more complicated than that. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Luca's hand tightened slightly on her cheek, his eyes darkening with a mix of emotions. "I do," he said, his voice raw, almost pained. "I've never felt like this before, Sophia." Sophia's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the intensity in his words. She should pull away, put distance between them before it was too late. But she couldn't move. She was trapped in the moment, in the tension that crackled between them like a live wire. And then, without warning, Luca's lips crashed against hers. The kiss was fierce, desperate, as if he was trying to claim her, to make her understand the depth of what he felt. Sophia's body melted against his, her hands gripping his arms as she gave into the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. There was no room for fear, no room for doubt, only the fire that burned between them, consuming everything in its path. But just as quickly as it began, Luca pulled away, his breath ragged as he stared down at her, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions. "I shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind reeling from the intensity of the kiss. "Why not?" she asked, her voice trembling. Luca's jaw clenched, and he stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. "Because I can't afford to care about you. Not in this world." Sophia's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and longing. She didn't want to care about him either. But it was too late. They were both caught in the web of their own emotions, tangled in a dangerous game where the lines between hate and desire had blurred beyond recognition. "You should leave me behind," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You should let me go." Luca's eyes darkened, and he shook his head. "I can't." Sophia's pulse quickened. "Why not?" Luca stepped closer again, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Because you've already gotten under my skin." Before either of them could say another word, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the tunnel, and Luca's expression hardened. He turned toward the door, his body tense, ready for a fight. "They're here," he muttered, his hand reaching for the gun holstered at his side. Sophia's heart pounded as Luca moved to block the entrance, his entire demeanor shifting back to the cold, ruthless man she had first met. But now, she could see the cracks beneath the armor, the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. "Luca," she began, but he silenced her with a look. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll handle this." Before she could protest, Luca was gone, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud, leaving her alone once more. Sophia stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the sounds of a struggle echoed from down the tunnel. She couldn't see what was happening, but every shot fired, every thud of bodies colliding, sent waves of fear crashing over her. She wanted to run, wanted to hide, but more than that, she wanted to know that Luca was okay. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Sophia's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Luca who stood in the doorway. It was one of the Ferraros.